Thank you for joining me. I'm Howard Nema. This is a 2007 lecture by G.Edward Griffin.
At the end of the 19th century, a secret society was formed by Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, as all of you know, I'm sure, was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was the political head man in South Africa, the chancellor, I believe they called him. And while he was there, he was able to acquire control over all of the diamond deposits and the gold deposits of South Africa, all of the mineral reserves. And in that period of time, he amassed one of the greatest, if not the greatest, fortune in the world. What people don't realize is that when he died, none of that money went to his heirs. Where did it go? It went through a series of 7 wills to create a secret society. The purpose of the secret society was to create a structure that would literally control the world from behind the scenes in a fashion that the average man or woman would never see it or never suspect it even existed. The Rhodes Scholarship, which most people know about, was just the tip of the iceberg that was created in one of the wills of Cecil Rhodes. And the purpose of the Rhodes Scholarship was to provide a funnel or a recruiting mechanism to find the most appropriate, the most likely individuals, young men and women, who could be recruited into this secret society. It should come as no surprise that William Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Fits perfectly into this scenario. This secret organization is not just of historical interest, it exists today. And according to Quigley and other observers who are close to it, it is the most important single historical force in the world since World War I. Just think about that for a moment. Is it true? Well, we'll cover a few facts and you judge it for yourself. The goal of the secret organization originally was to expand the British Empire and the men who were behind it, not necessarily the royalty, but the real political figures behind it, and I'll mention some of their names in a moment, to extend the British Empire to control the world, because Rhodes and his associates believed that the British had acquired the highest culture, the highest level of morality, according at least to his definitions of morality, and the highest standard of living, the most perfect language. He felt that the race was superior, and that for the benefit of the rest of the world, for their good, it was their responsibility, this group, using the British Empire, was their responsibility to rule the world for the benefit of the world, of course. It was very carefully spelled out in their writings and their goals. Now, this evolved not too long after the organization was put into motion. It changed. The goal changed. World domination didn't change. Control from behind the scenes by a very small elect group didn't change. But what did change is that the focal point for this was no longer the British or the, England, but it was to be a new world order, international in scope, and to be housed through an international organization of some kind. Initially, they had hoped that it would be the League of Nations, and all of their members worked very hard to create the League of Nations for that purpose. And when that failed, then they set their sights on the United Nations, which finally was put into action and now is on a fast track to becoming the very structure which they had projected as their goal. And now, of course, the center of all of this, instead of being in England, is focused primarily in New York. Now, the method by which this secret organization was to accomplish this incredible goal was not to be visible and not to go forth and influence the people directly, People weren't even supposed to suspect that such a thing was going on. The people were not even supposed to know the names, primarily, of the big players. They weren't to be in the news at all. The way this was to be done was indirectly, through the power centers of society, as they're called. The strategists behind this are brilliant, and they realized that human beings have a herd instinct. We clump together, most of us. A few hermits get off in the wilderness and do okay, but most of us get nervous out in the wilderness, and we congregate into villages and cities, and beyond that, we come together in organizations like this. We have leaders. We join labor unions. We affiliate with political parties. We come together in church organizations, and we send our kids to schools that are organized, and we have Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. And the way we operate is that we work through groups and organizations, and we follow leaders. They had this all figured out. They said, therefore, the way for us to lead the masses is not directly one-on-one, but what we must do is control the leadership of the organizations to which people belong. We don't need that many people to do that. So with just 1% or 1/10% of the population, we can control the entire population by controlling the power centers of society. That was their strategy from the beginning, and it is their strategy today. And I might add, it is an extremely effective strategy. The structure of this secret organization was outwardly modeled after the Jesuit order. Yes, incredible, isn't it? But Rhodes was an admirer of the organizational genius in his mind of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, and he said we should use that as our model. He didn't take it straight across, but he took many elements from it. And at the deeper level, though, it is interesting, I think, and very instructive to note, that he borrowed the structure of classic conspiracy control directly from Adam Weishaupt. Now, those of you who have studied this thing, you recognize that name. Adam Weishaupt was the founder of the Illuminati. And we all know a little bit about the Illuminati because it was disbanded in Bavaria shortly after it was formed. And their secret records and notebooks and so forth were seized and placed into the public record. So you can go to a library today and read verbatim the organizational structure of the original Illuminati. Now, there's a debate as to whether or not the Illuminati really was destroyed or whether it just went underground and still exists today. I think that debate is interesting, and I have my own opinions about it, but they're just opinions. In the final analysis, it's not too important because we know that there are shoots coming up from the ground with identical structures all over the place. Now, whether those shoots are coming up from seeds or roots, I don't think makes too much difference. The fact is that we have had many organizational imitations of the Illuminati, and this secret one that we're talking about here, created by Cecil Rhodes, is a perfect example. Now, what is that structure I'm talking about? It's what they call rings within rings within rings. That's the way they usually refer to it. And what that means is this. Weishaupt said that in the center of his Illuminati organization, there would be a controlling group of maybe 3 or 4 people, just a small number. These, in turn, would create a membership ring around them of a larger number, of perhaps 20 or 30 or something like that. And the members of that ring would not be aware that they were being dominated and controlled by the inner circle. Now, that outer ring then, in turn, thinking that they were the whole enchilada, would then create a larger ring around it, comprising of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people. And those people would not suspect that they were being dominated and directed by an inner ring. And then finally, that last ring would create still another one that would reach out to mass organizations, reach out to the masses. And in that fashion, Weishaupt said that a few of us in the center, through this carefully controlled structure of rings within rings, can control the world. And the people being controlled would never know that that's how it worked. Now that's the structure that Weishaupt created and described at some length, and it's interesting to me that Rhodes selected that very structure for his secret society. Now, let's take a look. Well, I'm glad there's not lead attached to that. The result of all this, ladies and gentlemen, is that this structure, this secret society, remains invisible to the average person. And it remains invisible not only because of its structure and because of its secrecy, but also because it has had the foresight of not having a name. Now just think about that for a minute. If you say that you have an organization or you create an organization and somebody says, well, what are we going to call ourselves? And the answer is, we're not going to call ourselves anything. We're not going to have a name. That way, nobody can talk about us. Brilliant. And that's what they decided to do. Quigley himself doesn't know how to describe it. At some places in his books, he calls it the network. In other places, he calls it the Rhodes Group. In other places, he just calls it the group. It has no name. And so therefore, that's another reason that it's invisible to the average person today. Now, at the inner circle of this organization that I'm describing, that was called the Society of the Elect. It originally consisted of Cecil Rhodes and a small brain trust of his very wealthy and influential political cronies from British politics and British banking. The center of gravity, as I said earlier, shortly thereafter, after Rhodes' death, which was very quick to move into that circle. And now we see that there are centers or secondary centers of influence within the Rockefeller Group and centers within such organizations as the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, to name just a few. And the goal shifted away from creating a world empire based in England to a world empire based in New York called the New World Order, but based on the model of collectivism. Now, the secondary rings around this Society of the Elect that Cecil Rhodes created were called roundtables. That's the name they gave them. Roundtable were called roundtables. That's the name they gave them. Roundtables. And these existed in the United States, Britain, and all of the former British dependencies. Finally, there was a tertiary group or ring around that was created. Each of those round tables in each of the countries created another ring larger around it, and they called those, in most of the British dependencies, they called those the Royal Institute for International Affairs. You'll find that in England, you'll find it in Canada, and so forth. That's what it's called. It's still there. Very powerful, prominent institutions in British politics in all of these countries. In the United States, for some reason which I've never been able to find out, they didn't choose that name, I suppose because royal wouldn't be an acceptable word in the United States. So in the US, they call it the Council on Foreign Relations. And ladies and gentlemen, after 100 years of penetration into the power centers of society, the Rhodesian network, which I call it, I have given it a name, and I hope you'll pick it up and use it because we have to identify this group. I call it the Rhodesian network or the Rhodesians. After 100 years, the Rhodesians now are very close to the final achievement of their goal in the Western world.